The pen felt heavier than it should have. Corinna Vale had held scalpels steadier than this, had sutured wounds with hands that didn't tremble, had delivered news to families that made grown men weep. And she had done it all without flinching. But this piece of paper, this single document on the glass table of a conference room that smelled of leather and someone else's cologne, made her fingers shake. Her husband's attorney slid it 2 inches closer. "Mrs. Whitfield, we've been here 90 minutes. She didn't look up. She was reading the same line for the 4th time. Irreconcilable differences. As though the phrase might eventually mean something different. As though the words might rearrange themselves into an explanation. Into an apology. Into anything other than what they were. She signed. The drive home took 40 minutes. She remembered none of it. She pulled into the driveway of the house she and Gregory Whitfield had bought 6 years ago. The house with the kitchen she'd gutted and rebuilt herself, tile by tile. The house with the oak tree in the back that had a swing. Gregory had put up and used exactly once, and she sat in the car for a long time before she realized she was pressing her palm against her stomach. Twins. She was 14 weeks pregnant with twins, and she had just signed away her marriage. Gregory didn't know, or rather, Gregory knew she was pregnant. What he didn't know was that it was twins. What he hadn't waited around long enough to find out. She had met Gregory Whitfield at a fundraiser for a hospital she worked at, the kind of event where name tags were unnecessary because everyone already knew who everyone was. He was real estate, development, the glossy kind, towers with names instead of addresses. He had a slow smile and he laughed at her jokes, which, her colleague Renata once said, was either a very good sign or a very dangerous one. They married after 2 years. It was a good wedding. Corinna had believed entirely and without reservation that it would be a good marriage. The cracks started quietly, the way cracks always do. Gregory worked later. Then he traveled more. Then he started having opinions about her schedule. Why was she pulling double shifts? Why couldn't she let someone else take the overnight? Why did her patients always come first? She was a neonatologist. Her patients were newborns, some of them barely 2 pounds, some of them breathing through machines smaller than her hand. She had tried once to explain that to him in a way that made him understand. He'd nodded and asked what she wanted for dinner. Then she found the texts. She hadn't been looking. She had picked up his phone to check the time, and the screen had lit up with a name she didn't recognize, Celeste, and a message that made the floor drop out from under her. She stood in their kitchen in her socks, and she read the thread that Gregory had apparently decided wasn't worth hiding, or hadn't expected her to ever see. And she understood that what she had taken for cracks was actually the whole thing. The whole marriage, crumbling quietly behind the walls she'd trusted, were solid. His explanation, when she confronted him, was almost worse than the texts. He wasn't in love with her anymore. It had happened gradually. He hadn't meant for it to go this far. Celeste Drummond was, and here he'd paused in a way that made Corinna feel like a wall was falling on her. Different, younger, less consumed by work. Corinna had asked him to leave that night. He'd gone without much argument, which told her everything the texts hadn't already said. 3 weeks later, through his attorney, came the offer. A settlement that was insultingly small, a non-disclosure clause, and a request that she not discuss the circumstances of the divorce with mutual friends. His attorney had used the word amicable 4 times in one letter. She had counted. She signed the NDA the same day she signed the divorce papers, because her own attorney, a man Gregory had somehow managed to recommend before she thought to find her own, told her it was her best option given the timeline. She was 13 weeks pregnant. She was exhausted. She had a night shift in 9 hours. She signed. The twins were born on a Tuesday in February, 7 weeks early, at 3:40 in the morning. Corinna had driven herself to the hospital because she'd told no one she was in labor, because the only person she would have called was her mother, and her mother had died 2 years before Gregory left, and that absence was still a gap in her life so large. She sometimes stepped around it out of habit. The hospital was the one she worked at. Half the staff knew her. The charge nurse on labor and delivery, a woman named Pat who had worked there for 21 years, held her hand through most of it and said very little, which was exactly right. Her daughter arrived first, then her son, both of them smaller than they should have been but breathing on their own, which the attending called remarkable. Corinna, lying in recovery with the kind of exhaustion that lives below the bones, had looked at the ceiling and thought, "I did this alone. I did this." She wasn't sure yet whether it was devastation or pride. She named them Willa and Jonah. Gregory's assistant sent flowers. Gregory himself did not come. The first 8 months were the hardest thing Corinna had ever survived, and she had survived her mother's death, and her own grueling residency and a marriage that turned out to be a slow and quiet lie. She had moved out of the house, too big, too expensive on one salary, and every room in it held the specific weight of something she was trying to put down. She found an apartment in a neighborhood that was not what she was used to, on the 3rd floor of a building, with a slow elevator and a landlord who was in the process of renovating the lobby, which meant there were tarps on the floor and the smell of fresh paint for the first 4 months she lived there. She worked. She had arranged a modified schedule through her department chief, Dr. Anand, who was gruff and practical, and had simply nodded and said, "Do what you need to do," when she explained her situation, which was more than she'd expected and more than she'd asked for. She had a nanny 3 days a week, a woman named May who was 63 years old, and had raised 5 children of her own and treated Willa and Jonah with the particular steady confidence of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. Gregory's child support was technically in the agreement. Practically, the amount his attorneys had negotiated covered approximately 1/3 of the twins' actual expenses, and the process of requesting an adjustment would require more legal fees than she currently had in any account she could access without selling something. She didn't think about him much. That was the strange part. She'd expected to grieve him the way she'd grieved her mother. That hollow ache, that reaching for someone who wasn't there. But Gregory's absence felt different. It felt like finishing a book and realizing, in the last few pages, that you hadn't been enjoying it for quite a while. What she didn't expect was Celeste Drummond. Corinna had known, logically, that Gregory would eventually surface. He did, about 4 months after the twins were born, with the kind of entrance that seemed designed to be seen. A profile in a regional business magazine, Gregory Whitfield and his partner, Celeste Drummond, interior designer, former competitive equestrian, photographed beside him in their new home with the kind of composed beauty that didn't come cheap. And a quote about new beginnings that made Corinna set down her coffee very carefully and breathe through her nose for a moment. She would not have cared. She had almost reached the point of not caring, which is different but close enough. Then Gregory's attorney called. He was seeking expanded custody, the attorney said. He felt that now that his circumstances had stabilized, Corinna heard now that he'd married Celeste without it being said, he was in a position to be more present in the children's lives. The attorney used the word partnership in reference to co-parenting, which was a word Gregory had shown no interest in for the first 7 months of his children's existence. He had visited Willa and Jonah 4 times. Corinna had the dates written down because her own attorney, a different one now, a woman named Sadie Chen who had been recommended by a colleague and who had immediately and quietly made Corinna feel that someone was finally in her corner, had told her to keep records. 4 visits in 7 months. He had held Jonah for approximately 6 minutes before handing him back. He had not changed a single diaper. He was now seeking expanded custody. Sadie Chen had said calmly, "Let him try," and something in Corinna had settled slightly. The man she met in the elevator was not remarkable at first. It was a Saturday. The lobby renovation had reached the 3rd floor hallway, which meant the elevator was the only way up. And on Saturday mornings it was slower than usual. Corinna was carrying Jonah in one arm and a grocery bag in the other. And Willa was in the stroller she'd managed to wedge into the elevator vestibule at an angle that required some geometry. And she was doing the specific arithmetic of a parent alone in public. How many limbs do I have? How many children? What is the acceptable number of seconds I can take my eyes off each one? When a man reached through the elevator doors just before they closed and stepped in. He looked at the stroller. He looked at the baby on her arm. He looked at the groceries. "I can take the bag," he said. She almost said no on instinct. She said yes. His name was Shepard Okafor. He lived on the 4th floor. He worked in public infrastructure. Urban planning, he said. Transit systems, the ingrained and unglamorous work of making cities function. And he had moved into the building 6 weeks ago. He had warm eyes and a very direct way of speaking. And he asked, in the elevator, whether the twins were identical, which was a question that always made Corinna laugh a little, because Willa and Jonah looked almost nothing alike. He helped her get the stroller through the hallway. He handed back the grocery bag at her door. He did not ask for her number. He said it was nice to meet her and went upstairs. She thought about that later, that he had just helped, without agenda, without even a lingering look that needed to be filed away and dealt with. She hadn't realized until that moment how unused she'd become to that. To someone just being decent without needing something back. They ran into each other 5 more times over the next 2 months. Corinna was not counting. She simply noticed. In the elevator, in the lobby, once outside a coffee shop 2 blocks away, where they both apparently went on Sunday mornings, and had somehow never overlapped before. Each conversation was longer than the last. Shepard was easy to talk to in a way that required no management. He asked about her work with genuine curiosity and didn't perform interest. He actually listened, asked follow-up questions, remembered things she'd said the week before. He made her feel, gradually and without theatrics, like someone worth listening to. He met Willa and Jonah properly one Sunday, when Corinna's stroller had a wheel malfunction in the lobby, and he happened to come through the door. He crouched down to the twins' level and said hello to each of them, with the kind of unhurried attention that babies, in their unfiltered wisdom, tend to respond to. Willa grabbed his finger. Jonah examined him with the gravity of a small scientist. "They're incredible," Shepard said, looking up at her. She said thank you, and meant it in a way she hadn't anticipated. They had dinner for the first time 3 weeks after that, at a Vietnamese place near the building that she recommended, and he paid for without making it a thing. He told her about growing up between Houston and Lagos, about his grandmother who had been a civil engineer and was, he said, the most competent person he'd ever known. She told him about her mother, which she didn't do often, and didn't feel the need to pull back after. She was not looking to fall in love. She was not ready, or she didn't think she was, and she had told herself that clearly and filed it somewhere and moved on. But the thing about Shepard Okafor was that he did not move fast. He moved at the speed of something real, which is slower than falling and much harder to talk yourself out of. The custody case was the worst month of her life. Not because Sadie Chen wasn't effective, she was devastatingly effective, but because Corinna had to sit across a table from Gregory Whitfield and the attorneys he could afford and be quantified. Her schedule, her apartment, her income, her mental and emotional fitness as a mother, all of it laid out like inventory. Celeste Drummond came to one of the hearings and sat in the gallery and said nothing, but her presence was meant to say something, and Corinna felt it land. She had her records. She had her 4 dates. She had pediatric appointment logs and daycare notes and the detailed calendar she'd kept for 9 months. She had Sadie Chen. She also, unexpectedly, had Shepard. Not in the courtroom. She hadn't asked him and he hadn't pushed, but in the way that mattered. The texts that checked in without pressure, the evenings after long hearing days when he brought food to her door and sat with her while she ate and did not ask her to explain or perform okayness. He played with Willa and Jonah on the floor of her apartment with the ease of someone who had decided, quietly, that these children were worth his time. The judge's decision took 11 days. Gregory received 8 days a month, supervised for the first 6 months, with a review. His support obligation was recalculated. Corinna sat in Sadie Chen's office and read the judgment, and felt something release in her chest that she hadn't known was held. The magazine piece was not her idea. She had given a talk at a medical conference. Nothing unusual, she'd done it twice before. On outcomes in premature twin delivery, drawn from both professional data and, she mentioned in passing, her own experience. Someone in the audience worked for a health publication. They reached out. The piece they ran was thoughtful, not sensational, and it touched on how she'd navigated the early months as a single parent while continuing her work in neonatology. It was not meant to be a comeback story. It was just her life, described accurately. But Gregory Whitfield read it, or someone near him did, and they made sure he saw it. She didn't find out directly. She found out because her colleague Renata sent her a screenshot of a comment thread where someone who was almost certainly Gregory's assistant had posted something pointed about the article. And someone else had responded with a timeline that was accurate enough to be troubling. The thread had been deleted by morning. But these things are never fully gone. What followed was not, as Corinna had half expected, a legal threat. It was silence. A long-waited, deliberate silence from Gregory's direction that felt, somehow, more satisfying than any confrontation would have been. Celeste Drummond deactivated her public social media accounts for 3 weeks. Gregory declined to renew a development contract he'd been close to closing with a firm whose senior partner had read the article, and apparently found it memorable. Corinna learned this from Sadie Chen, who had her ear to certain walls. She had not set out to expose anyone. She had simply told the truth about her own life in a room full of people who were listening. That had turned out to be enough. The proposal was not dramatic. It did not take place on a rooftop or a beach or with an audience. It was a Thursday evening in her apartment. Not because Shepard lacked imagination. He'd once taken her to see a dawn launch of a transit bridge he'd spent 3 years designing, which was one of the most unexpectedly moving things she'd ever watched. But because she was home from a particularly hard day, and Jonah had been running a low fever all week, and Willa had reached the stage of toddlerhood where No was her entire personality, and Shepard was there, on the floor, making Willa laugh with a wooden spoon and a colander, and he just looked over at Corinna where she stood in the kitchen doorway, and said quietly, "I'd like to do this for a long time if you'll let me." She'd known what he meant. She'd asked if he was sure. He said he'd been sure for a while and had been waiting for the right moment. And then Jonah had sneezed and they had both attended to that. And later, after the twins were in bed, she'd said yes. Shepard Okafor adopted Willa and Jonah 14 months after the wedding. Gregory Whitfield, given the opportunity to contest it, did not. The night of the hospital gala, 2.5 years after Corinna had stood in a conference room and signed her name to the end of something she'd believed in, she wore a dress that her friend Renata had helped her choose deep blue. And she walked in beside Shepard, who was very tall in a suit, and who kept his hand at the small of her back with the uncomplicated ease of someone who considered that his place. She had been named to the hospital's board of directors. That was why they were there. Gregory Whitfield was also there. Apparently, he'd donated to the hospital's capital campaign, the kind of donation that gets your name on a table. She saw him across the room before he saw her. He looked, she noticed, approximately the same. Older in the specific way that money slows but doesn't stop. Celeste was beside him in something silver and structured, and she saw the exact moment Celeste clocked, who had just walked in. Then Gregory turned. He saw Corinna. He saw Shepard's hand on her back. He saw, she was fairly certain, the person she was now, which was not the person who had sat across from his attorneys with shaking hands. They did not speak. There was no scene, no confrontation, no moment of theatrical triumph. The room was full of people who mattered more than this did. She had a board seat. She had twins who were currently asleep at home with May, and who had, that morning, made her a card out of construction paper for no reason, other than that they felt like it. She smiled at Gregory Whitfield. Not a smile that meant anything, not a performance, just the polite acknowledgement of someone she used to know, and she let Renata pull her toward the table where her name was printed on a card, and she did not look back. Later that night, in the car going home, Shepard asked her how she felt. She thought about it for a real moment. "Like someone who made it to the other side," she said. He took her hand. The city moved past the windows, all lit up, the way cities are at night when you're going home to somewhere good.